It's a damn tough life full of toil and strife we whalermen undergo, and we don't give a damn when the gale is done how hard the winds did blow, 'cause we're homeward bound from the Arctic ground with a good ship taut and free. And we won't give a damn when we drink our rum with the girls of old Maui. Rolling down to old Maui, me boys, rolling down to old Maui. We're homeward bound from the Arctic ground, rolling down to old Maui. Once more we sail with the northerly gale through the ice and wind and rain. Them coconut fronds, them tropical lands we soon shall see again. 6 hellish months we've passed away on the cold Kamchatka Sea. But now we're bound from the Arctic ground, rolling down to old Maui. Rolling down to old Maui, me boys, rolling down to old Maui. We're homeward bound from the Arctic ground, rolling down to old Maui. Once more we sail with the northerly gale towards our island home. Our mainmast sprung, our whaling done, and we ain't got far to roam. Our stunsail bones is carried away, what care we for that sound? A living gale is after us, thank God we're homeward bound. Rolling down to old Maui, me boys, rolling down to old Maui. We're homeward bound from the Arctic ground, rolling down to old Maui. How soft the breeze through the island trees, now the ice is far astern. Them native maids, them tropical glades is awaiting our return. Even now their big brown eyes look out, hoping some fine day to see our baggy sails running for the gales, rolling down to old Maui. Rolling down to old Maui, me boys, rolling down to old Maui. We're homeward bound from the Arctic ground, rolling down to old Maui. Rolling down to old Maui, me boys, rolling down to old Maui. We're homeward bound from the Arctic ground, rolling down to old Maui. What a song. All right. How's it going, everybody? Hello, my friends. Got an interesting stream for you tonight. It's a little late. I'm a little late to the party, but I'm here to discuss Christopher Columbus and whether or not he was a crypto Jew. Before I continue, though, let us, can we get a confirmation in the chat that my audio is coming through loud and clear? I got a new cable for my microphone. My microphone was messing up. I think it was definitely the cable, because it seems like this new cable works, but can I get confirmation here? Keep on getting a warning from OBS. I hope my stream latency is okay. But just any, we got 2 people. JB in the chat. What's up, JB? Hope you're doing well. Before I get into this, I just want a single confirmation. You can hear my voice. I'm coming through loud and clear. Okay, excellent audio. Wonderful. Almost a week ago today was Columbus Day. And just before Columbus Day, there was a bombshell article in the press claiming that new DNA evidence confirmed that Christopher Columbus was Sephardic Jewish.
And the response that I found on the sort of right wing online on Twitter and other places was a little lackluster to this announcement of Christopher Columbus being a crypto Jew. It seemed like a lot of people on the right, and I have some responses that we will get into here. A lot of people on the right had a knee-jerk reaction to this. They did not want to believe that Columbus could have possibly been a crypto Jew. And at the same time, these people, generally speaking, I'm not naming anyone in particular about this, but generally speaking, what I saw was people accusing the Jews of trying to steal European figures from history and claim them for the glory, for the splendor, for the high renown of somebody like Christopher Columbus. The Jews just want to steal him from European history. But what I think, unfortunately, was the honest truth is that these people were having a knee-jerk reaction, trying to hold on to Christopher Columbus purely for the renown, purely for the glory. And the reason I believe that is because they chose almost exclusively to focus on this DNA study rather than look at all of the evidence that is available. Because it's easy to split hairs with the DNA issue. And if you only look at that, it's easy to introduce doubt and create a picture that seems like there's some kind of bias going on, some kind of sort of deception going on. But I believe if you look at the entire picture and all of the evidence that is available, that has been available for hundreds of years, the claim that Christopher Columbus was a crypto Jew becomes more and more probable. And by the end, we disconnected. Told me I disconnected. And reconnection successful. Let me make sure I'm still going here. Okay, it looks like I'm still going. So if you look at the full picture, it becomes more and more probable that Columbus was you-know-whoish. And by the way, before I continue, I've got a little addition to the table here. I got a Aristotle bust from my dad, who recently went to Greece. He picked this up in Athens. It's an authentic, handmade alabaster Aristotle bust. So I had to include it on the table, at least for tonight. But let's take the time tonight to really dig deep and look at every piece of available evidence, because I believed that there was a good chance that Columbus was a crypto Jew prior to the publishing of this DNA study. And there were a number of reasons for this. There are a number of other scholars who, prior to me, historians and scholars of Jewish history, who also believed that Christopher Columbus was a Jew prior to this DNA evidence. So I found, like I said, the response from the right to be lackluster and disappointing because they focused almost exclusively on this DNA evidence, as we will see. So I'll start the stream by reading some of these responses from the right. We're going to look at Keith Woods recommended this thread by Laura Seafarer on Twitter. Tom Roussel, Survived the Jive, made a brief comment on the question. And Carl Rodel, or Radel, wrote a Substack piece on this, calling it The Myth of Columbus's Jewishness. So we'll go through these three responses, and then we will look at the evidence that exists outside of the DNA claim so that we can, build a big picture, look at the whole life of Columbus, look at all the evidence that he left behind. And then once we have done that, we can look at the DNA study and see what it really means, what the significance of it is. Whether it's confirming something that the overall analysis of Columbus is leading us toward, or if it's, just this irrelevant or misleading study that the people in this response would have us believe. So let's begin with Keith Woods recommending Seafarer, who says, so people are now claiming that DNA, let me make this a little bigger. People are now claiming that DNA proves Columbus was actually a Jew from Valencia and not Genoese. Source is an RTVE doco aired last night. I don't know what these words mean. RTVE doco. This thread will look at the evidence presented by the network found here in a summary on its own website. Okay. So that's a TV network, apparently. The study confirmed this Jewish origin with the Y DNA and mitochondrial DNA of his son Hernando. First of all, mitochondrial DNA is inherited maternally, so it is not relevant to Chris. Secondly, how has Y DNA confirmed he is Jewish? Did they do a specific clade analysis? It is not specified. If any Spanish speakers have more information, please share it. But at the moment, it seems based on the fact that he had J Y DNA. The haplogroup is J. This makes the assertion quite ridiculous, as such a wide clade is found over much of Europe, including the Ligurian coast, and not just Jews. All of this is true. Furthermore, even if a specifically Jewish clade was found, it could simply indicate distant paternal ancestry. It is not evidence that the man was Jewish himself. So the genetic justification for Columbus's Sephardic origins is not very strong. The rest of the evidence presented is based on this flawed genetic evidence. They claim that since Jews had been expelled from Genoa and restricted in the 12th century, he could not be from there. However, subsequently, Jews were present in Genoa and were later expelled in 1515. So it is clear that there was in fact a community present in Genoa. They then claim that Columbus never wrote in Italian. This is false, as glosses and notes in books he owned were written in Genoese and Italian, respectively. Furthermore, his earliest Spanish writings were poor, indicating it wasn't a first language. They then use the fact that Columbus in Genoa are unrelated as some sort of damning evidence, but that is fairly common with surnames. Valencia is confirmed as a location due to the tradition of silk weaving there, so again, weak. To conclude, this does in no way prove Columbus was Jewish, nor that he was from Valencia. There is overwhelming historical evidence that he was Genoese in his own writings and those of his contemporaries. This documentary is sensationalist slop and should not be taken as fact. So all of this is focusing on genetic issues. Him being of the J. It keeps on telling me I'm disconnected. I hope this doesn't keep happening. Now it says I'm reconnected. I'm not sure what's going on. The fact that he had the JY haplogroup, which is associated with Jews, Sephardic Jews, but it is, like he's saying, present throughout many other locations in Europe and among many other ethnic groups. So in and of itself, it is not like it's not sufficient to prove that he was Jewish. Carrying on to Tom Roussel, who basically says the same thing. Apparently, the newly identified DNA of Christopher Columbus is being used to claim that he was a Sephardi Jew based only on his Y haplogroup. We'll have to wait until data is published, but you cannot determine ethnicity from Y haplogroups alone. Otherwise, you must conclude that the Austrian painter, Hitler, was a Somalian, because he had some E1, B1 or something haplogroup, allegedly. True. That's true. But the problem here is that the claim is not based only on his Y haplogroup. That might be the case in this particular genetic study. But overall, in the scholarship of about Christopher Columbus and people who are claiming that he's crypto-Jewish, the Y haplogroup is not at the top of the list of evidence. And somebody in his comment section actually mentions this, which is it's going to foreshadow a bit of the evidence in favor of him being crypto-Jewish that we'll get into later. But this person, Gilly, says he often used the Hebrew calendar in his journals. He wrote in lots of the language. He used the Hebrew calendar in his journals that he wrote in. Lots of the language he uses is unmistakably Jewish in formulation too. For example, La Casa Santa is a direct calque of Hebrew Beit HaMikdash, which is not Christian at all. His backers were all Jewish. The date of the departure of his first voyage was delayed by 1 day. That day was Tisha B'Av. And that same day, August the 2nd, was the very last day that Jews were allowed to be in Spain. His game plan appears to have been to find such wealth that he could fund a Christian army to retake the Holy Land, and then the Jews would have somewhere to go. He said that he wanted to find enough gold and the almost equally valuable spices, quote, in such a quantity that the sovereigns will undertake and prepare to go to conquer the Holy Sepulchre. For thus I urged your highnesses to spend all the profits of this my enterprise on the conquest of Jerusalem. And he links to another thread. And Tom, once again, like I said, lackluster in response, says, I don't know how much of what you said there, or how much of what you claim there is true, but none of it discounts what I said. Choosing to focus back on the genetic question, when basically just, I don't know what you're saying is true. I don't really want to engage with what you're saying. I'm here to just focus on the genetic evidence. I would argue that what Gilly posted, the types of evidence that Gilly is posting, namely textual analysis and biographical analysis of Columbus himself, is far more important to determine whether he was a crypto-Jew than the genetics. And that's the point. If you only focus on the genetics, like Tom is saying, it's basically a question that can never be resolved. And we have to focus on analyzing the texts left behind by saying I'm disconnected. This is really annoying. Can anyone confirm if I'm like pausing in these moments when it tells me that I'm being disconnected? Because it keeps on saying disconnected and then reconnection successful. Green Fez in the chat says, does it matter that some historical figure has 1/64th Jewish genetics? Once again, that's not the issue. We're not arguing about genetics. We're arguing about whether he was actually crypto-Jewish. And that's why okay, people are saying that it's just the notifications being weird. Okay. That's why you have to look at the texts that he left behind, the biographical information that we have, the personal connections that he had, and put together a full who he actually was in his lifetime and what he actually believed personally. That's why the genetics are not as important as the evidence that I'm about to present, I would argue. But here we have the heavy hitter, Karl Radel, who is a well-respected, apparently a PhD historian. And we're going to look at what he had to say as well, which, once again, focuses almost exclusively on the DNA. He makes one particular claim that I'll highlight while I read his Substack here, but for the most part, it's focused on the DNA. So, the myth of Columbus's Jewishness, addressing the latest DNA evidence claims. Recently, we were greeted by loud claims by the Jewish-run mainstream media that Christopher Columbus was a Jew, and that this was, quote, proven by, quote, new DNA evidence, with Reuters announcing that Columbus was a Sephardic Jew from Western Europe, study finds. The Independent shouted Christopher Columbus was secretly Jewish, new DNA study reveals. And the Times of Israel screamed, study finds Christopher Columbus was a Sephardic Jew from Western Europe. This wasn't really a massive surprise to historians familiar with the Jewish propaganda campaign to try and use genetics to try and shore up nonsense, and often long debunked claims that major figures in European and world history were Jewish. For example, similar claims have been made on similarly dubious DNA evidence about Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun, among others. And, as previously stated, the key to understanding claims such as these is how the study is conducted, what the actual claims are, not the broad claims made by the media, and if the claims stack up with the study being used as the basis for them. Let's begin with the Daily Mail's rundown of the actual claims being made. And here's the quote from the Daily Mail. Many historians have questioned the traditional theory that Columbus came from Genoa, Italy. Other theories range from him being a Spanish Jew or a Greek to Basque, Portuguese, or British. To solve the mystery, researchers conducted a 22-year investigation led by forensic expert Miguel Llorente by testing tiny samples of remains buried in Seville Cathedral, long marked by authorities there as the last resting place of Columbus, though there had been rival claims that he was buried in the Dominican Republic. They compared them with those of known relatives and descendants, and their findings were announced in a documentary titled Columbus DNA, The True Origin, on Spain's national broadcaster TVE on Saturday. We have DNA from Christopher Columbus, very partial, but sufficient. We have DNA from Hernando Colón, his son, Llorente said in the program. And both in the Y chromosome, male, and in the mitochondrial DNA, transmitted by the mother of Hernando, there are traits compatible with Jewish origin. Around 30,000 Jews lived in Spain before the Reyes Católicos, the Catholic monarchs, Isabella and Ferdinand, ordered Jews and Muslims to convert to the Catholic faith or leave the country. Many settled around the world. The word Sephardic comes from Sefarad, or Spain in Hebrew. After analyzing 25 possible places, Llorente said it was only possible to say Columbus was born in Western Europe. On Thursday, Llorente said that they had confirmed previous theories that the remains in Seville Cathedral belonged to Columbus. Research on Columbus's nationality was complicated by a number of factors, including the large amount of data, but the outcome is almost absolutely reliable, Llorente said. Now back to the voice of Karl. Now, if we read this closely, we should note that what Llorente actually says is self-contradictory, and that he states that, quote, the outcome is almost absolutely reliable, but also that both in the Y chromosome, the male side, and in the mitochondrial DNA, which is the female side, of Hernando, there are traits compatible with Jewish origin. Put another way, all Llorente is actually saying is that his DNA evidence has proven is that both sides of Columbus's family have genetic material that is compatible with a Jewish origin, not is of a Jewish origin. The latter is how Lorente and the Spanish television documentary, which I have watched, are seeking to spin the findings, probably for free publicity and also because of Spain's policy of granting citizenship to Sephardic Jews as a sop to international Jewry, which 90,000 largely Israeli Jews have already used to acquire Spanish and European Union citizenship as part of its Golden Visa program, which is not what Lorente's study suggests. Interestingly, what the Daily Mail article, and almost all media outlets for that matter, conveniently ignores, and for obvious reasons, is the problem of providence of these remains, in that Columbus was actually buried, in accordance with his wishes, on the island of Hispaniola, now the Dominican Republic and Haiti. As Vicente Olaya explains in El País, quote, Columbus's bones have been preserved in a tomb in Seville Cathedral since 1899, when control of Cuba passed from Spain to the United States, and the Spanish authorities left Havana, where the explorer's remains have been interred until then. A series of haphazard transfers over the centuries, first to the Spanish cities of Valladolid and later to Seville, then to Santo Domingo and Cuba, raised questions about whether the bones might have been lost or replaced during these transitions. In fact, Dominican Republic authorities maintain that Columbus's body never left the island and is still buried in Santo Domingo's cathedral. Add to this the fact that Lorente claims very little genetic material could be extracted, but tries to shore up his claim by saying very partial but sufficient, which is a weaselly way of saying I don't have much material to go on, but I need to imply otherwise. This means that there is doubt over the providence of these particular bone fragments, in part because the Dominican Republic actively contests that they are not actually Columbus's bones, which they maintain are still buried in Santo Domingo, and that even then Columbus's alleged remains have been disinterred and transferred on multiple different occasions over the centuries, which opens up very serious and significant doubts as to whether it is Columbus's bones that Lorente is using. This is the problem with Lorente's study, in that he has taken DNA evidence from a skeleton that may be Columbus's, but is of doubtful and unproven providence, and compared it to the graves of his two bastard sons, Diego and Ferdinand, then announced that it is related. The problem is, and what Lorente or the Spanish documentary never brings up, is that a genetic relationship between Diego and Ferdinand and the remains is both tenuous due to the lack of significant amount of suitable genetic material from the alleged remains of Columbus, and also need not be Columbus himself. The issue, you see, is that Columbus was granted the rights to rule the Indies as Admiral of the Ocean Sea and Governor of the Indies, with his sons and their descendants being made admirals of the Ocean Sea/Indies, and governors, later viceroys, of the West Indies, and Columbus's grandsons, such as Luis Colon, were the Marquesas of Jamaica, which means that they were in the area for significant amounts of time. Now, add to that, Columbus's son Diego married Maria Alvarez de Toledo. These were Luis Colon's parents, and they were involved in the running of Hispaniola, and that the Alvarez de Toledo line has been recently suggested to be of partial converso origins, based upon genealogical research. Then we already have a potential candidate for this alleged possibly Sephardic DNA, in that all that Lorente has proved is that Diego and Ferdinand were related to the individual allegedly reburied in Seville from Santo Domingo, not that Columbus was that individual. Okay, so let me stop here. There's a lot of gymnastics going on here. Honestly, it seems like he's really getting legalistic in trying to introduce this doubt. Yet he's saying the sons of Columbus were known. Their identity was known. But Columbus himself, the remains that they believe are Columbus himself, isn't 100% known. But there is enough genetic material to establish a relation to these two sons. But it could be just some other relation. It might not be Columbus himself, is what he seems to be trying to argue. And he also seems to be arguing that, okay, the sons have Jewish DNA, but that Jewish DNA may have come from the fact that Columbus's first, well, these are grandchildren apparently. The son of Columbus that these two were descended from, he married a crypto Jew, Maria Alvarez de Toledo. And that's where this possibly Sephardic DNA came from. But that's kind of that's not great evidence, because the very fact that Columbus's son married into a crypto Jewish family actually lends credence to the idea that Columbus and his family, himself and his sons, were themselves crypto Jewish. Most crypto Jewish families were not marrying outside of crypto Jewish lines, outside of the crypto Jewish community, especially at this level of society. These people were, like he said, Marquesas of Jamaica, admirals of the Ocean Sea, governors of the Indies. Like, these people were at pretty high levels of governance at that time, high levels of society. And the crypto Jews who lived at that time were marrying pretty much exclusively with each other. So he's trying to explain away this possibly Sephardic DNA that's found in the descendants of Columbus by saying, oh, well, that probably came from the fact that they married a crypto Jewish woman. It might not have come from Columbus himself. Okay, I mean, that we're starting to get into the territory of gymnastics, of mental gymnastics, because it's Occam's razor. We just make it way simpler by assuming that Columbus himself was Jewish. It makes everything else make a lot more sense. So, but here's, I want to keep reading and get into the one claim that I would like, if Carl Radel ever sees this video or, hears about it and wants to respond, this is, to me, the most important thing that he says coming up. So let's get there. We have a potential candidate for this alleged possibly Sephardic DNA, in that all that Lorente has proven is that Diego and Ferdinand were related to the individual allegedly reburied in Seville from Santo Domingo, not that Columbus was that individual. Lorente is merely assuming this and hasn't eliminated the very real possibility of the individual concerned being another Columbus relative, which is quite likely, or a bastard child of Columbus's by another mother, as we know that he had numerous sexual relationships with women other than his longtime mistress, Beatriz Enriquez de Arana. A major problem with Lorente's claims that the remains are those of Columbus is also the fact that back in 2004, when these remains were exhumed, it was quickly realized by Spanish physical anthropologists that they could not have been Columbus's given their age and size. Okay, so more doubt that these particular remains were of Columbus. Let me get to the important thing here. Once again, he's stressing it's only compatible with a Jewish origin. It's not definitely of a Jewish origin. Genetic studies of Sephardim are lacking. Okay, he's introducing more doubt onto the genetic question. Jewish haplotypes also have pan-Middle Eastern markers. More about Sephardic DNA studies. They have genes in common with non-Jewish Spaniards, Portuguese. Okay. So he's saying basically all that this says is that it's compatible with Jewishness. You can't rule out Jewishness. Now I'm trying to find here is a statement that he made about certain writings of Columbus that have been widely regarded as fakes. That's the important thing I'm looking for here. Sorry about this. I should have maybe I'm thinking of somewhere else. As you can see, I mean, it's almost exclusively focused on the genetics question. And all that we conclude at the end is that Columbus's DNA is compatible with Jewishness, with being a Jew. And I think that's all that can be really determined by genetic evidence of somebody who was buried back in the 1500s. So that's the point, is that if we're only going based, we're left with an open question. That's all that we're left with. We're not left with confirmation that he was or wasn't, but only that he could have been, that it's possible. And the way that we can resolve the question is by doing a textual analysis of him, of his writings, of his biography, of the facts that we know about him, his personal connections, and put the whole picture together and come to a reasonable conclusion based on all of the evidence. So I'm going to give you all of the evidence, because it seems like I don't know if these people are aware that Columbus was being argued to be a Jew long before the DNA evidence. I don't know if they're aware of that, or if they just don't want to engage with the arguments that were around on this issue before the DNA question came up. So, but it's disappointing, and I wish that one of these people would have engaged with the evidence that I'm about to present. So the first thing I'm going to do is show you a video. And then we'll read through the Wikipedia page that gives more specifics. And then we will we'll get into some of the stuff that Miles Mathis talked about in his article. But first, let's listen to. He's a professor at a college in Canada, focused obviously on Jewish studies. Just look at his face, and This is what he had to say about Columbus being Jewish. I'm going to stop here and there and give commentary.
Hello, fellow students of Jewish history. First of all, I want to say thank you to all of you who have sent me notices saying, hey, did you see that Christopher Columbus was actually Jewish? Thank you very much. My email box is absolutely stuffed. Please stop sending the messages. I got it. I was a little bit miffed by the news because in 2017, I gave a lecture on this topic in which I said that he probably wasn't Jewish. And now I am once again proven wrong. I hope my wife does not see this video. But what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about what has been discovered. And then I'd like to play you the material that I said back in 2017 that still is quite relevant, and then come back and say, well, what does this all mean for our understanding of Columbus's background, right? Okay, so here we go. First of all, the new genetic testing that has been conducted was done on remains that are believed to be those of Columbus and also those of his son. And the DNA research indicates that there are features both on the Y chromosomes and associated with the mother that are consistent with patterns found in Sephardic Jews. Now, we should mention here a very important caveat that according to traditional Judaism, DNA is not in itself sufficient definition of Jewish status. Mitochondrial DNA through the mother is much more significant, but in general, DNA is not used as a definition of Jewish status. What the study actually indicates is that Christopher Columbus had DNA that was comparable to DNA that many Jewish people had, and that's something that a lot of people have, especially in the Iberian Peninsula, especially in Portugal, and actually in America. There are quite a few people who don't identify as Jewish and nevertheless have some Jewish DNA. We know that Christopher Columbus himself was especially cagey about identifying one way or another, which led to a lot of the mystery that swirled about his origins literally for centuries. So let me
pause there for just a second. This guy fully acknowledges that the DNA is merely consistent with him being Jewish. It's not like a full confirmation or anything like that. It's fully consistent with it. But then he brings up the interesting point that I also brought up on Twitter, which is that his origins were shrouded in mystery for centuries, since his lifetime. And the very fact that his ethnic origins were shrouded in mystery and have been the subject of centuries-long debates, as is also said here on Wikipedia, that very fact is itself one piece of evidence in all of the evidence that we're going to look at to suggest that he was Jewish. Nobody else in Europe had the motivation like ethnic origins. Nobody but the Jews had that motivation. So anytime I see a figure in history with occulted ethnic origins that are hotly debated, it makes me it's a first red flag to look at and to think, why are his origins so shrouded in mystery? Why did he go to such great lengths to obfuscate his ethnicity? That's a question to consider. It's one point. It's one point on the side of him being a crypto. Play for you what I had to say in 2017, which kind of runs through the evidence one way or the other, and then I'll admit the part that I no longer believe after we see this short clip.
So the question, so was Christopher Columbus Jewish? The answer is, to give it away, we can all go home right now, probably not. It is highly unlikely that he was in fact Jewish. But still, we still have the question, why wouldn't one think so? Let us just quickly look at the work of Cecil Roth. We actually studied his work earlier. He wrote several books on the history of the Inquisition and the experience of Jews in late 15th century Spain. He wrote about Columbus that the mystery regarding Columbus's origins is largely the outcome of his own mendacity, meaning Columbus himself enjoyed projecting the image that he was secretly Jewish. It was kind of like a chutzpah kind. So anyways, his own mendacity, meaning he used to lie. He used to dissuade. He used to, try to put it in people's faces like, don't mess with me because I have Jewish blood. He would say like, do you know who I am? I descend from King David. He would say things like this. He would write things like this. And he openly cultivated this kind of mystique surrounding his lineage that he hoped would add to his own grandeur. There are many characters like this you see in Jewish history. Another good example of someone who actually was ethnically Jewish would be, for example, Benjamin Disraeli, who was baptized and lived his life as a Christian, but he really enjoyed throwing it in the faces of his parliamentary interlocutors that he in fact was Jewish, and he had a unique kind of skill and a unique kind of logic that they had no access to. So he played up this quite a bit, and we shall see some of them. But since Columbus frequently made these references, and his background is incredibly murky, Roth concludes, as a result, it is equally impossible to exclude or to confirm the hypothesis that he was descended from a Jewish, probably not, but there's enough nagging doubts that at least we can talk about it for half an hour or so. Let's look at those nagging doubt issues. So here we go. The first of all, his surname. We say Columbus in English, but it would be Colon. He also signed his name as Colom, Christophe Colomb. This was a common Italian name, so used quite often by Italian Jews. He could connect himself to many Italian Jewish families.
Okay, so I'm starting now I'm going to do this little Word document as we go. To tally up the points on either side here. On one side, was Christopher Columbus Jewish? On one side, not Jewish. The DNA evidence is not conclusive, but only consistent with Jewish origins. That's all I could really gather from the arguments on the not Jewish side. On the Jewish side, so far, we have he has an intentionally scrubbed ethnic background, which has been hotly debated for centuries. 2, his original surname was Colon, which is a common Italian Jewish name. Let's carry on.
There's quite a bit of dispute as to whether or not he came from Italy. He refers to himself as coming from Genoa. Also, there's documents that indicate he may have come from Majorca, even documents that he may have come from Poland, which is another possibility for this Jewish origins, but none of them are really very reliable. Quite likely he may have come from Sicily. So the last name is something. The first name, definitely not. Christopher, of course, means bearer of Christ, one who carries Christ. So that's not a typical Jewish name, just like Mary. As I mentioned earlier, Columbus loved making references to his Jewish origins, in person and in writing. This is kind of like a dangerous thing to do because we're living in a period when the conversos are being actively persecuted, and at the same time he was kind of like a transitional liminal figure that was moving in and out of many royal courts from Portugal and Spain, Italy, elsewhere, trying to gain support for his venture, and whatever he thought would make himself look more exotic and more appealing in his request, he would not hesitate to use. But nevertheless, that's part of it. Third, we know he had a lot of Jewish friends. He had a tremendous amount of associations with Jews. He was very close with Abraham Zacuto in Portugal. You recall we spoke about him for an hour a few weeks ago. And he relied very heavily on Zacuto's astronomical research. The astrolabe that Zacuto had refined by making it out of metal was incredibly important to Columbus, as was the Alphonsine tables that were translated through Hebrew into Latin for him. He had many Jews on his ship. We're not precisely sure because we only have like the ship manifests. They're not complete, and they have surnames. Very many of them we simply don't know what the biographies of them are. We do know that his translator was Jewish. This is, by the way, a typical kind of Jewish profession. Jews in medicine, Jews in law, Jews in finance, and Jews in linguistics are very big. Jews, the exception of American Jewry, it's a very unusual exception, 20th century American Jewry, very monolingual. But for the most part, Jews typically are polyglots, speaking several languages and very valuable to their host societies as a result. I have a feeling that might be because Jews tend to exist on the outsides of mainstream society. In America, where we were accepted so well and so deeply, especially in the second half of the 20th century, we lost a lot of our linguistic skill because it was not necessary. But in the first half of the 20th century and earlier, perhaps in the later 21st century, we will develop that again. Hard to say. He was also very close to conversos, that is, Jews who had converted to Christianity during the course of the Inquisition. In particular, de Santagel, who was one of his main economic backers, a very important person in the...
Okay, so he was personally close with conversos. We'll add that. We'll add here to this... One of his sons married a converso Jewess. The royal court of Isabel and Ferdinand, who supported him and made crucial recommendations to allow the king and queen to promote his work, and a man named Sanchez as well, another major backer. And in fact, when he actually discovered the New World, and he returned back and landed in the coast of Africa, he immediately sent letters describing his discovery to the king and queen. Obviously, he couldn't send letters back from the New World because the postal service was not too great, connecting transcontinental messages. But he did not address those letters to the king and queen. He sent them to his Jewish buddies, or his converso buddies, de Santagel and Sanchez, people he writes to. There are some really tantalizing things, like, for example, he was the ships, and by the way, you should recall that he spent about a decade petitioning wealthy kingdoms to back his enterprise, pushing for his idea, bouncing from state to state, spent a lot of time in Portugal, no luck there, eventually ended up in Spain and got a positive yes from Isabel and Ferdinand, and the ships were completely outfitted in the first week of the month of Av, and he was ready to go on Tisha B'Av of 1492, and he delayed it one day. Even though everything was set to go, but since that is an inauspicious day in the Jewish calendar for travel, one does not embark on major journeys of any type on Tisha B'Av. For reasons that no one can really adduce, he decided to push off this highly anticipated departure for the day after. He wanted to not leave on Tisha B'Av, perhaps. Then we have lots of things that he himself said in his own writings, like his journal of his trip to America, which of course was a very celebrated work, began with the sentence, "On the day that the Jews were expelled from Spain, I set out for the New World." I mean, the very first clause of the very first sentence of his journal references the Jews and their situation in the Iberian Peninsula. A remarkable kind of way to begin this document. It doesn't begin that something like, "I knew I would find land." It begins with, "The Jews were expelled from Spain." Let's have a look at some of his personal correspondence. Here's one of the few letters that we have in his own hand that he wrote to his son Diego. There's a whole story about what happens after he discovers the New World. He ends up kind of dying in disgrace and madness and not having any credit. And so we do have a lot of material from after the discoveries as well. This is one of those letters. And you'll see on the top left corner, there's this funny little squiggle right where the arrow is, right where the cursor is, you see over here, that is not part of the letter text itself. And looks a little bit like he's testing out the ballpoint on his pen. But of course, this is about 400 years before they invented ballpoints. So what exactly is that? Some scholars have opined that it looks something like the traditional invocation at the beginning of a Hebrew letter. The letter is Beit Hey. I didn't have my computer easy access to handwritten letters. Like, you would look a little different if you wrote them by script rather than in the Assyrian block script like this. But in fact, you can conceivably see you've got the Beit on the right and the Hey on the left in a cursive script, which is an abbreviation for the term Baruch Hashem, or blessed is the name. Which reminds me of a joke that I will try to tell you right after this. So signing the beginning of his letters with this strange little
swiggle. And by the way, he only did it in his letters to his sons. He didn't write it to other people, so just as a family thing, perhaps then as Baruch Hashem. And you may be asking, but it's on the wrong side of the page. What do you want from him? He's pretending anyways. I don't know. It's true. Normally you would write this on the right-hand side of the page, but it's not at all uncommon to see it at the center at top as well. So it would be terrible if he puts it on the left. It doesn't even look very neat, but neither does his Castilian there too. One last detail from this same letter. He developed this rather unusual signature that he was very particular about. You can just see it here. I have another copy that shows it in a little bit greater contrast here. No one has yet been able to decipher this strange signature that not only did he use in the latter years of his life, but he insisted that his children also use this signature, which is a strange kind of thing to do. I want you to sign my name like I sign this name, not on checks or something like that. This part we can sort of figure out. The X is, of course, the Greek chi letter, as in Christos, and this is the Greek R and the Greek O, so Christo, this is a short form for Christopher, let's say, or just for Christo at any rate. And then ferens is a Latinized version of the fur part in Christopher, meaning the one who bears Christ, right? Christos, ferens, Christopher. So that part is easy. But what's the business with this, either the Latin letter X or the Greek letter chi, an M and a Y, which could be an U, and the SAS with those two dots around the S's, which he insisted on being written exactly like this, in this shape, and so on. So Cecil Roth, a major historian who we saw a little while ago, he argued, not specifically, not really convincingly, but nevertheless it's worth noting that this was kind of like a secret symbol to his sons that they should say Kaddish for him after he died. The conversos did definitely use a lot of secret messages that they handed down in all kinds of coded forms to their children. Do this behavior to remind you of a particular mitzvah that we have to keep, and so on. So it's not at all impossible, but it's difficult to see this in his signature. Nevertheless, you take all of these things together, and you can add it up for yourself. It's hard to believe that he was actually Jewish. I think it's more likely that he liked the image of being Jewish, and he actively cultivated that with his population. And that's about it for the...
So obviously what I have to take back from what I said 7 odd years ago is that whereas I believed at that point that Christopher Columbus probably, I have to say that probably he was in fact Jewish. Now, and I'm just kind of bummed out by this because I wish we had this DNA evidence like a half century ago when colonialism was still favorably regarded in the Western world. Now it's just like another reason why people don't like Jews.
Now, here's something important to note, too. He doesn't want to claim Christopher Columbus. This guy thinks that Christopher Columbus is going to give Jews even a worse reputation than they already have, as if that was possible. But, there's a lot of, like I said at the beginning, a lot of people on the right who said, the Jews, they just want to take Christopher Columbus for the glory, for the renown. They want to steal our figures from our great figures from history. This guy doesn't want Christopher Columbus on his side, but he's willing to accept it based on the evidence. It seems like he's reluctantly accepting that this is probably the truth.
What are you going to do? Figures. But let's just clarify what we're talking about here. What we're saying is that Christopher Columbus, he himself, we know, did not identify exclusively as a Jew. In fact, that would have been virtually suicidal. At least it would have been a career killer at the time he lived. He identified as a faithful Catholic, perhaps for pragmatic reasons. But as I said before we watched the 2017 clip, his ancestors were quite likely Jews. Now, Why did they become Catholics? Most likely they were victims of the forced conversions in the pogroms of 1391, or possibly he was descended from the many conversions that followed the disputation at Tortosa in 1414. These are people who are the so-called Marranos. That in itself is a derogatory term. A more appropriate term would be something like crypto-Jew or a converso. And that population, which was quite significant in the Iberian Peninsula leading up to the year 1492, it actually constituted a very major element in the migration to the New World from the Iberian Peninsula in the 16th and 17th centuries in particular, and from Portugal especially. And that brings us back to the Caribbean, which is where we're really looking forward to visiting this January with Kosher River Cruises. If you don't have a spot yet on the boat,
Okay, that's enough of Henry Abramson. So here we've got the list so far. On the not Jewish side, we have the DNA evidence is not conclusive, but only consistent with Jewish origins. On the Jewish side, we have that his ethnic origin is seemingly intentionally scrubbed, hotly debated for centuries. The only people in Europe who really had a strong motivation to hide their ethnic origins were the Jews. Number 2, his original surname, Colon, was a common Italian Jewish name. 3, he made cryptic references to his Jewish origin. 4, he had lots of Jewish friends and associates and financiers. One of his sons married a converso Jewess, and the first people that he wrote from the New World were his Jewish friends. Number 5, he delayed his departure until after a Jewish holiday. Number 6, multiple Jewish references were made in his own journals and logs. Number 7, he included the Hebrew BH, which is a blessing or invocation in Judaism, and he only included this in signature or in letters to his own son. And number 8, an unusual signature that he used could have been a cryptic anagram for a Jewish prayer. So we've got 8 points on the Jewish side and only 1 on the not Jewish side. And here we can get even more points on the Jewish side by going to this Origin Theories of Christopher Columbus page on Wikipedia, where we go down to Crypto-Judaism. And we see as early as 1940, scholars, historians were arguing that he was a crypto-Jew. This is founded on many observations of Columbus. Here's some more specifics. For example, he referred to the expulsion of the Jews in his first accounts. The reference to the Second Temple of Judaism that he used was in the Hebraic term second house. So it's kind of using Jewish slang within his own references to Judaism. The Hebrew letters Bet He, meaning Bezerat Hashem, were on all but one of his letters to his son. That's that squiggly little figure that Henry Abramson showed here. So this squiggly figure, which bears a resemblance to Bet He in cursive in Hebrew, was found on all but one of his letters to his son. So this was not just like a squiggle accident. This was found on multiple letters in the same way, and so it's obvious it's not just like an accidental squiggle that he put on there. Continuing here, this is the anagram substitute for the Kaddish, according to Cecil Roth. That was this part of the video. That's what Cecil Roth argues is an anagram, cryptic anagram. Another piece of evidence lies in the fact that many of the personalities who supported Columbus before the king and queen of Spain were of Jewish origin, and that his voyage was mainly funded by 2 Jewish conversos, Luis Santangel, Gabriel Sanchez, and Don Isaac Abarbanel, also mentioned in this clip here. In 1973, Simon Wiesenthal postulated that he was a Sephardi. Argued that his concept of sailing west to reach the Indies was less the result of a geographical theory than his faith in certain biblical texts, specifically the book of Isaiah. He repeatedly cited 2 verses from that book, quote, "Surely the isles shall wait for me, and the ships of Tarshish first, to bring thy sons from far, their silver and their gold with them." And, quote, "For behold, I create new heavens and a new earth." Weisenthal claimed that Columbus felt his voyages had confirmed these prophecies. Jane Frances Amler shared those views in 1977. Estelle Irizarry echoed this as well, further noting that Columbus always wrote in Spanish, occasionally included Hebrew in his writings, and referenced the Jewish high holidays in his journal during the first voyage. So he wrote in Hebrew, referenced Jewish high holidays. We can add those to the list. A document suggests that Columbus belonged to a Marrano family from Majorca. The document has not been proved. The novelist Robert Graves argued that his surname is still common in the island. An international study. Okay, so this is about the genes. So that's everything on the Wikipedia page. Now we've got all the mainstream. Oh, got a little spider coming down here. We've got all the mainstream evidence that's presented by historians, by scholars of Jewish history, going back decades. This is all the mainstream stuff. Okay. I believe at this point we already have enough to say, if we include the DNA consistent with Jewish origins, and all of this circumstantial evidence, I think it's reasonable to conclude there's a good probability that he was Jewish. So this ends like the mainstream confirmed evidence. Now we're going to get into Miles Mathis, who, if you don't know him, he gets into some less than mainstream evidence and creates arguments that aren't found in sort of mainstream academia or scholarship. But I still think it's worth talking about. And I still, Miles Mathis doesn't like me. I told him I wouldn't promote his stuff anymore, but he sometimes does. Otherwise, I would just be like plagiarizing him. So I have to at least give him credit. So, here he republished the page. This was published back in August, but in October he says, just 2 months after his paper came out, the mainstream Jewish press is now admitting that Columbus is Jewish. The results of that DNA test that they've been sitting on for years finally came back from the lab, These results also indicated that Columbus was not from Italy, but from Spain or Portugal, just as I say below. Do any of the mainstream reports link to this groundbreaking paper? What do you think? So, our first clue here, so he does some portrait analysis. I'm not going to read word for word, but he mentions the fact that he's like his earliest depictions give him a very long nose, very long face, and only later did they kind of de-Judaize his features, and that this picture that's one of the most famous of Columbus is not actually confirmed to be Columbus. It seems like it was the text here that indicates that this is Columbus was added later, after this painting was originally made. And he even makes the point that this head looks like it may have been altered, because the proportions are all off. The head looks way too small on this body. I mean, the hands are bigger than the head itself, which is, I have big hands, and they're not bigger than my head. Whereas this Columbus portrait looks very weird. So, as he says here, this common painting that people associate with Columbus, doesn't match contemporary accounts of him. The words were added later. And even now it's only said to be Columbus. So it seems like this could have been a later effort to make Columbus a non-Jew. So, but let's get into the actual details about Columbus himself. Here, we find another clue, perhaps the biggest. His wife, Columbus's wife, the Portuguese noblewoman, Filipa Moniz Perestrello. He married her in 1479 when he was 28 and before he was famous. So how did he manage that exactly? Wikipedia says, quote, discussing the question of how Christopher Columbus, the son of a Genoese wool weaver, could marry the daughter of a Portuguese knight of Santiago, a member of the household of Prince John, Lord of Reguengos de Monsaraz, the master of Santiago, and of the Prince Henry the Navigator's household, Samuel Eliot Morison wrote that this is no great mystery. Philippa was already about 25 years old. Her mother was a widow with slender means, and her mother was glad enough to have no more convent bills to pay, and a son-in-law who asked for no dowry. And they wonder why we don't trust historians. Let me make this bigger. That is the worst sort of pettifogging. And gee, who was Samuel Morison? Only a rear admiral in the U.S. Navy. So Phoenician Navy himself. Oops. Samuel Morison. He was actually an admiral in the Navy, giving some naval history. He was a close relative of T.S. Eliot. Morison came out of the Phoenix SK Club at Harvard. Man, is this easy or what? But it was worse than pettifogging, since all that stuff about her mother being of slender means with convent bills is just bold-faced lying. Philippa Perestrello had her own commandery, which means she owned feudal lands that paid her rent. Philippa was not a nun paying bills, she owned the convent. Do you think Morison wasn't aware of that? They admit it in previous sentences at Wikipedia, but then try to bluff you with this poverty stuff a few paragraphs later, figuring you don't know what a commandery is and won't even click on the provided link to find out. And by the way, this is common with a lot of figures in history that are promoted out of these Jewish families. They're all very often given these nonsense rags to riches stories, portraying them as these, unconnected upstarts coming from nowhere, coming from poor peasant families or whatever, and then suddenly they're just like at the height of society. They're at the highest position of prominence that one could achieve. And they expect people to believe this, even though, details within the biography contradict it. Such as this, she owned a commandery, but she's poor and, worried about paying off convent bills, even though the family that she's connected to is highly established within high society in Portugal, and they own large amounts of land, and, it's just obvious contradiction. Carrying on, so this is just more indication that Columbus was not the son of a Genoese wool weaver. But there is a clue even in the lie, since weaving points right at the Jews as well. It indicates Columbus's family may have been involved in textiles, but as owners of big companies and vast lands, not as weavers. And this is something else, okay? The wool textile industry was to a great extent dominated by Jews. We saw this when we were looking at when Scotland was Jewish as well. The thing that brought the Jews up to Scotland was the wool industry. They loved trading textiles. They would go and source their textiles from places like Scotland, bring them down to places like Italy and Spain, and in these like industrial workshops have the raw material turned into textiles, which they would then ship to other places, and they dominated that trade. So in and of itself, we can add to the Jewish side involved in the textile industry. A heavily Jewish trade. But it gets better. Filipa's father wasn't just a Knight of Santiago. He was also Phoenician Navy. All you have to do is click his link at Wikipedia, where they admit that he was a ship owner, a navigator, and explorer himself, having discovered Porto Santo Island. He became its lord and governor. Filipa's grandfather was Micer Filippo Palestrelli, a Lombard knight and nobleman of King John I of Portugal. Several more clues there, since the Lombard knights were crypto-Jews, and the same can be said of John, who was an Avitz. They come from Henry II of England, as well as from the Dukes of Burgundy, making them Capetians as well as Plantagenets, Dunkelds, and Comnenés. They also come from Rollo the Viking, making them Phoenicians and Comnenés once again, although through Alfonso of Castile, they take us directly back to Isaac II Angelos, the Byzantine emperor of the House of Comnene. And there's a lot of Northern European royalty that can trace back to this Byzantine Comnene family. David I of Scotland being one of them. King David I being from when Scotland was Jewish. The authors argue that he was like the first Jewish monarch of Scotland. So we can add to this list of evidence in favor of him being Jewish. He married a woman of high nobility while being presented as a peasant upstart. Same thing happened with Karl Marx. Excuse me. Filipa's grandmother was Caterina Visconti of that Italian noble house. Filipa's great-grandfather, Palestrelli, was a nobleman of the house of Joao, son of King John I. So they are admitting that Columbus was not just marrying the daughter of a knight, he was marrying into a royal house. And to do that, Columbus must have been royalty or other very high nobility himself. Otherwise, the marriage would have been forbidden. It indicates Columbus was Portuguese himself, not Italian. It doesn't take much digging to find some historians admitting that, though the mainstream dismisses them, telling us that, quote, this theory has been dismissed by most scholars. You mean the mainstream scholars who will be paid off to say anything? But the evidence that Columbus was Jewish/Portuguese stacks to the moon, while the evidence that he wasn't looks manufactured and false. Such as, well, the biggest clue here is that when he returned from his first famous voyage, he didn't report to his alleged sponsors, the King and Queen of Spain. No, he reported first to the King of Portugal. Also curious is that Columbus spoke and wrote in Hebrew and celebrated the Jewish holidays on his voyages, which we already mentioned. He used the Jewish calendar. Why would a Gentile from Genoa do that? If you still don't believe me, you may want to read this page on myjewishlearning.com. They admit that his birth name, Cristobal Colon, was Jewish, and that his mother was a Fonterosa, also Jewish. His grandfather in that line was Jacob, and his great-grandfather was Abraham. Then they give you this quote: "I am not the first admiral of my family. Let them give me whatever name they please. For when all is done, David, that most prudent king, was first a shepherd and afterward chosen king of Jerusalem, and I am a servant of that same Lord who raised him to such a dignity." They admit Columbus was surrounded by prominent Jews, including the astronomers and navigators in the Spanish court, Joseph Vicento and Martin Behaim. Also, Abraham Zacuto of the University of Salamanca, who assisted Columbus. Even more important was Luis de Santangel, originally Chinichillo or Chinillo. I hate pronouncing Spanish names. The driving force behind the entire enterprise. As Controller General and Chancellor of Aragon, Santangel provided the funding for his trip, a large part of it from his own personal fortune. Look at this little midget. That's Santangel, and no, it isn't shortened. He was way under 5 feet tall. Wikipedia admits, quote, "After his expeditions, Columbus was granted the island of Jamaica, which became a place of refuge for many Sephardi Jews after their expulsion from Spain and Portugal." Recently, we also saw Jamaica was home to the Scottish Gordon, who was potentially a crypto Jew that led the slave revolt. So we begin to see connections. We begin to see the fog of history lifting before our eyes, and we can see how some of this stuff was actually happening. Santangel's heir, Antonio de la Cadena Maluenda, became the treasurer of New Spain in 1525, continuing the Jewish financial dominance of the New World. Other Jewish sponsors of Columbus's voyage were Gabriel Sanchez, Aragon's treasurer, and Don Isaac Abarbanel, treasurer of Portugal. At Wikipedia, they pretend not to know where the name Abarbanel came from, but it's obviously a variant of Bourbon, the kings of France, by the way. Remember, the Jews aren't too particular about their vowels. It's all about the consonants. Drop the vowels, and it's the same name, isn't it? With a bonus at the end, El, the high god of the Phoenicians. Another major funder of Columbus was Lorenzo di Pier Francesco de' Medici, through his Seville agent Gianotto Berardi. In fact, they invested more than Santangel. This is hidden in most accounts of Columbus, including his Wikipedia bio, and I only discovered it on Vespucci's page. This is of interest here because I have shown that the Medicis were also crypto-Jews, and in 1492 the papacy had already been taken over by Jews. Later that year, a Borgia would be pope, and the Borgias already had a pope in the 1450s. The Medicis would take the papacy in 1513. Look at these good Christians. As usual, a visual here is very helpful. These are the popes of the 1400s. Borgia is in the middle. Nice of them to give us profiles, isn't it? They aren't shy that way. Columbus just happened to leave on August the 2nd, the date of the Jewish expulsion. All of those on Columbus's ships were Jewish, including his bursar and his surgeon. We are told that his trip was funded in part by expelling all the Jews from Spain and stealing their property, but you can be sure that that isn't true. As we are seeing, all Spain were Jewish, including the royals. so they could hardly expel all the Jews. You will say, are you telling me the Inquisition wasn't pointed at the Jews of Spain? That's what I am telling you. Some Jews who weren't following the party line may have been swept up, but in general, we know going in that this couldn't have been aimed at Jews since the country was run by them. Same as now, the early years, the Inquisition wasn't mainly about Jewishness. It was about Christian heresy. It was run by the Dominicans, an especially nasty group of cloaked government agents. Remember, the Dominicans were founded by a Spanish guy named Dominic de Guzman, and as with many popes, we have no idea where this guy came from. No genealogy. But as usual, it's very obvious, since Guzman is a Jewish name. They were nobles from the beginning, later being dukes of Medina, the first being Alonso Perez de Guzman, who they pretend was a Muslim from Morocco. You have to laugh. A later Duchess of Medina admitted the historians had cleaned up their history, making it more palatable to Christians. But even her admission is spun. She wasn't admitting to being a Muslim. She was admitting to be a Jew. These Guzmans later ruled Toledo, a famous Jewish Phoenician stronghold. The wealthiest man in Spain at the time of Columbus was a Guzman, the second duke. In the 1500s, a Guzman was commander-in-chief of the entire Spanish Armada, and by that time they had married into many other top Jewish lines, including Sotomayor, Zúñiga, Mendoza, Ponce de León, Braganza, and Aragon. The last means that they had married into the royal family, something no Muslim could do. Wikipedia, after misdirecting for many sentences on the genealogy of Saint Dominic de Guzman, finally admits that Pero Tafur conceded that he was from this famous de Guzman family of billionaires. Tafur should have known, since he was a de Guzman himself, so you should find it very curious that the Dominicans were founded by billionaire Jews. Or not so curious, since that is what we have always found. The Dominicans were founded to spread the gospel and oppose heresy. Strangely non-Christian, isn't it? What about turning the other cheek? The Dominicans' role in the Inquisition and their founding by billionaire Jews tells us that it was never about battling heresy. It was always about using the church for pillage. If someone has something you want, just charge them with heresy, throw them in jail, and take it. Wealth accumulation 101. We can be sure that this happened in the 1400s to fund Columbus, but again, it wasn't aimed at Jews. We can be sure the Jews were the most spared, if anything. It was aimed at anyone making money, but not bowing deeply enough to the governors and treasurers. Anyone not prostrate before the mobsters was targeted. But back to Columbus here. To see the current state of the lie, you may consult Wikipedia, as usual. They have a page on the origin theories of Columbus, which is slanted to vertical in favor of the Genoese story, but which is otherwise all spin. I encourage you to read it closely, since it has zero real evidence in favor of that theory. Most of the evidence is a list of previous historians or other people who just said that he was, as if it was evidence. In a court, all that would be dismissed as hearsay. They are just repeating what someone told them, which isn't evidence. Wiki leads the page with only 2 documents, neither of which will convince anyone. The first is a probably forged note allegedly in Columbus's hand in a deed of primogeniture, which first was produced by his heirs in 1578 in court during a squabble over money. The second is a note to his bank that says, "Though my body is here, my heart is constantly there." So they're leading with that. That is an example of their best evidence. Genoa isn't even mentioned by name, so here or there could be anywhere. And just because your heart is there doesn't mean you were born there. I might say my heart is in Bruges, but I wasn't born there. The next section of proof is his son Ferdinand's book, but they admit everyone knew Ferdinand was a big liar, not to be trusted on any issue. So again, it is hard to understand why they include this section. It undercuts their own argument, but it's all they have. If Columbus really was from Genoa, it shouldn't be hard to find documentary proof of that, especially considering his prominence. We have seen that he had to have been aristocracy to marry Philippa, and any aristocracy in Genoa would have extensive documentation. It is simply beyond belief that we would have to rely on a short note to a bank later in his life. This page at Wikipedia is so weak it unintentionally acts as proof that Columbus was not from Genoa. Amusingly, the page does give us more proof of the Jewish theory, since it admits Columbus used the Bet Hai letters on all but one of his letters to his son, as well as an anagram for the Kaddish. They also admit that Simon Wiesenthal and Robert Graves both believed that Columbus was Jewish. You will say that is more hearsay, but it isn't, since Wiesenthal and Graves both did a lot of research. They didn't just parrot the party line. Repeating the party line is easy and requires no research or courage, but bucking the party, especially if you are Jewish, is very difficult. I am no fan of Wiesenthal, as you may know, but you may have to ask why he would blow the mainstream cover here. It would be like blowing the Anne Frank story, so it doesn't fit his profile or assignment. Another thing is almost lost on that page, since they point out something else. When Columbus wasn't writing in Hebrew, he was writing in Spanish. At first, that didn't sink in, because they didn't put it in the way that it begs to be put. He never wrote in Italian. Why would an Italian never write in Italian? He didn't speak Italian either. As for Columbus being Portuguese, Wikipedia admits, proponents of the Portuguese hypothesis also point to a court document which stated that Columbus's nationality was Portuguese, and in another, Columbus uses the words "my homeland" in relation to Portugal. Strangely, Wikipedia footnotes the second document, but otherwise has nothing to say about its authenticity. The court document is not even footnoted, since NB 29 doesn't mean anything. It has nothing to do with the 29th footnote. So why would we dismiss these court documents while accepting the sad Genoese documentation? No answer to that. Crickets. Then Wikipedia tells us about the DNA study, saying it began in 2021. Another lie, since, as you are about to see, it began 20 years ago. 6.5 years ago, Forbes published an article admitting that Columbus's early life looks made up, and suggesting that he was Portuguese rather than Genoese. That is true, but unfortunately this looks like more misdirection, since they are selling Branco's theory that Columbus is really a guy named Pedro Ataide, who changed his name to avoid persecution, and surround the right answer with noise. They were doing DNA tests on the bones at that time to prove that theory, but almost 7 years later we are given no update, indicating that it wasn't all another bluff. Why? To get your name off the name Cologne, which is Jewish. Also to get your name off his mother, Fontarosa. If Columbus was really an Ataide, he would have a different mother, so they could bury that clue. I'll just finish this page, and then I think we've had enough. The Irish Times finally published an update on the DNA tests in January of 2023, admitting that it had taken 2 decades already and promising results by the end of the year. But here it is more than a year on, more than a year and a half later, and no results. My guess is that they confirmed the Jewish hypothesis and have been working on some big lie to spin it. The usual. All these scientists and writers pretend the big question is what city or state he is from, but that is almost beside the point. What matters is not the place, but the bloodlines. I have already shown you that he is from royal Jewish lines, so I have no interest in this DNA question. So far, they have only used DNA to muddy all these questions, so I won't trust anything they tell us at this point. For One example, Henry Gates at Faces of America on PBS did Meryl Streep's DNA and told her that she wasn't Jewish at all. She looked at him like he was crazy. She believed that she was Jewish before the test and still does. Everyone with eyes knows that she is Jewish, but this is what they do. They stand in front of the sun and tell you it is night, then get mad when you don't believe them. But why lie about Streep or Columbus? Because they need you to believe that someone besides highly promoted Jews has been famous in the history of the world. You might get just a little suspicious if you found out that every famous person in history was Jewish or Phoenician. If we return to My Jewish Learning, we find this, quote, "In New Spain, as many as 2,000 conversos settled in Mexico City, Guadalajara, Veracruz, Puebla, and Guatemala City. In New Castile, approximately the same number of new Christians resided in Lima, Poto, Tucumán, and Cordoba. By the 1630s, hardly a town in the Spanish Empire did not shelter at least a scattering of conversos, some of whom migrated as far as New Mexico and Florida. Their vocations were no less diverse than in Europe. Among the conversos there were numerous artisans, shoemakers, spice makers, tailors. Others were ranchers. Several new Christians were priests. One was a bishop. There were converso military officers. The mayor of Tecali was a new Christian. Yet, as in Europe, most of the Sephardim gravitated toward commerce, several becoming managers of silver mines. Others were gem and food dealers. They played their traditionally decisive role in the import-export market, including the slave trade. Altogether, new Christians were as prominent in the Americas as in Spain, Portugal, or the Netherlands. Quote, new Christians and conversos are Jews. Notice they also admit that these crypto-Jews were Catholic priests and bishops. Why would they want to become Catholic priests? We know to avoid persecution. So why pretend to be priests? To infiltrate the church and blow it up from the inside, of course. Also to use the church to create schism, and perhaps most importantly, as to use the church to steal wealth. But let's back up and look more closely at Columbus's wife, Philippa, since there is much more we missed the first time. Philippa was Jewish in her mother's line as well, since Moniz is Jewish too. See Ernest Moniz, Portuguese, the fake nuclear scientist who was Obama's Secretary of Energy. Look at this dude. What the hell? What's going on with the hair? He's got like the No Country for Old Men looking hair. Wow, what a countenance. That photo makes me laugh because it proves again that a picture is worth 1,000 words. Imagine him in period garb instead of that suit. He looks like he tunneled in from the 16th century, doesn't he? Even having the right Phoenician haircut. Despite having a big wig in the field, he knows far less about the nucleus than I do. Okay, blah, blah, blah. So he talks about other Monizes. I think that's enough. So if you want to look more into the genealogies, check out Miles Mathis's whole page here. He analyzes some clues from Columbus's ships, talks about their ship names, Nina, Pinta, Santa Maria. Here he looks at the strange signature. He says that mainstream will say that it's an unsolved mystery why he did it this way, but then mentions how Cecil Roth, a Jew, solved it easily. This British historian pointed out that the anagram was very similar to the pyramidal letters with dots that appeared on Jewish gravestones in Spain, being a cryptic substitute for the Kaddish, the prayer recited by Jewish mourners. It allowed and encouraged his sons to say their prayers covertly. The Jews love being covert, don't you know? So, here he's looking at Queen Isabella. So, there you have it, gentlemen. There you have it. Let's go back. I don't think I even got all the points, but here's just a brief recap. He's not Jewish, according to the critics, because the DNA evidence is not conclusive, but only consistent with Jewish origins. However, on the other side, we have decades of scholarship and historical research doing textual analysis, biographical analysis, genealogical analysis, etc., symbolic analysis, etc., etc. And we have 11 points here that lead me to believe personally that it is highly probable that he was Jewish. It would take. It just seems like there's the theory against this would have to be so convoluted. It would have to include so many different twists and turns. The simple explanation that cuts through everything, that elegantly explains all these details, is that he was simply a crypto Jew. That's what makes the most sense to me, and that's my personal opinion on it. If people like Laura Seafarer or Survive the Jive or Carl Radel would like to actually grapple with all of this surrounding evidence rather than just focus purely on the DNA, I would love to hear their response to this. I have no personal stake in this game. I've never looked at Christopher Columbus personally as a great hero. In my opinion, and in my experience growing up, I always idolized people like Eric the Red and Leif Erikson far more than Christopher Columbus, because I identify with the Norwegians, the Norsemen. I feel like the way that they conducted their travels and exploration was far more heroic and adventurous and interesting. And they were the first Europeans to actually arrive on Europe. So I take a lot more pride in them. I would feel a lot more emotional about it if somebody came to me and said that there's evidence that Leif Erikson was Jewish. That would make me knee-jerk against it. I would probably have the same reaction as someone like Carl or Survive the Jive about Leif Erikson that they have about Christopher Columbus. But I've never looked up to Christopher Columbus, and honestly, we gotta reach a point of maturity where we kill our heroes, and we realize that we have to be willing to accept hard facts and be honest about the facts, and revise what we know about history, or what we think we know about history. We have been lied to about so much in history that people need to stop being surprised when evidence like this comes out. And it doesn't mean that everybody in history was Jewish. It doesn't mean that Europeans never did anything to be proud of. It doesn't mean any of that. It just means that this one particular figure was probably Jewish. And a lot of the efforts of colonialism and empire building from Europe were carried out, planned, and helped along by prominent Jews. And we need to be honest about that fact and revise our understanding of history based on that fact. Someone says Eric the Red was actually Eric Rothschild, Red Shield. Oh shit, no. And the fact that I have a red beard must mean that I am also a Rothschild. Anyway, so that's my presentation here on Columbus. I thought it was going to be a lot shorter than that actually turned out to be. Bach Precision says opium wars in China had a lot to do with the Sassoons, the Rothschilds of the East. Indeed, that's correct. A lot of the modernization of the Far East, economically speaking, politically speaking, socially speaking, a lot of that came from Jewish merchants and financiers that funded the Far East getting built up to what it is today. So, if anybody has any quick questions, I will answer you. But let's see, how long have I been on here for? Hour 45 minutes. So I'll probably go for another 15 if you guys want to ask any questions here. Good presentation we'll share with my peeps, says Bach Precision. Thank you. You know, the problem with this, I mean, I'm not that great at making really flashy content that catches people's eye, that, you know, puts it into like TikTok format of points, you know, to get people's to keep people's attention. This type of content that I'm putting out here, this type of presentation, requires that you have the time, the patience, the attention span, and the interest to follow along and get into the weeds of these questions. And a lot of people don't have that, really. They're not that interested, honestly, and they're motivated more by the emotional question of like, are we claiming Columbus or are the Jews going to get Columbus? And it becomes this like emotional thing for them. And I think that's why, you know, you see a response like this from Survive the Jive, who just says like, oh, his haplogroup doesn't confirm he's Jewish. Boom, case closed. And it gets 1.8 million likes, but this person who responds with some of this like textual evidence that he was potentially crypto-Jewish, it only gets 64 likes, and Tom responds by basically saying like, I don't know, I don't care if that's true, basically. Like, I'm not going to engage with these points. And he gets on that one. So you've got it, like the level of the conversation has to be a little higher, I believe. You know, if you're going to come out and take a swing at Christopher Columbus, or you're going to come out and claim that, you know, this new study that shows he's Jewish is nonsense, or you're going to say that it's a myth, like Carl says, you know, we got to like be able to, in good faith, engage with all of the evidence and all the arguments and all the points that have been made. And these people just didn't do that with Columbus because, like I said, there's such a mystique, there's such an aura of heroism that Columbus has been given that most people are not really interested in an objective investigation or an objective like hearing of all of the available evidence. They just want to have their preconceptions or their biases confirmed. And, you know, it's kind of disappointing to me. JB says Messianism, Secrecy, and Mysticism by Laura Arnold Liebman, a must read. Let's give that a quick Google. A new interpretation of early American Jewish life. Interesting. JB, is this is there a full copy available on the internet? You could buy a digital copy for $29. Caligula says, I was told the Austrian painter was Jewish and that Beethoven's mother was black African. Yeah. But nobody has any letters from the Austrian painter where he's referencing like him celebrating Jewish holidays or writing in Hebrew or including cryptic anagrams that refer to the Kaddish or things of that, or he wasn't like the evidence that surrounds Columbus is nothing like any of the evidence of the Austrian painter. Proxy War says Christianity has been a good cover for Jews throughout the ages. Absolutely. I'd like to find a copy of this. What the hell? Oh, did it do it? Nice. This looks like a full copy, or at least... No, it doesn't. Never mind. That's too bad. Well, at Z Library. Okay, nice. Maybe I'll have to search it on Yandex or something, because I'm not. Hey, if you could send me a link on if you could send me a link on Twitter, that'd be great. Adam S says River Forest Library probably carries it. Maybe. Or the Oak Park Library. I'm sure that would carry it. Adam, if you're in the area, let's meet up sometime or something, man. I've been thinking a lot about trying to create a local meetup, and the problem is I just don't know of enough people to make it happen, and I don't want to just start fires in random places without, having at least a core group, having at least me plus my wife plus a couple other guys at least before before like broadcasting flyers or something about doing a meetup. But if you're interested and you're in the area, you left Illinois. Okay. Well, if anybody watching this show is from the Chicago suburbs, message me. I'd like to get some kind of meetup group going. So, all right, gentlemen. That's what I got for today. I know the last couple streams I talked about how I want to go through the whole When Scotland Was Jewish book. And I still would like to do that. It's taking a lot longer than I expected, and things always pop up in life. So I still want to do that, but I think the next stream that I'd like to do is going to be about morals. And I've been working on a paper for Substack, like trying to give a sort of concise, coherent explanation of my moral theory in general and how it relates to a lot of important topics. And this fella, Ermenarikes, a friend of mine on Twitter, who we've talked for years now. He wrote an interesting thread on Twitter that kind of touches on some of these ideas, combining philosophy and physics, bridging the gap of philosophy and physics, analyzing Nietzsche's will to power in relation to Gady's rope hypothesis. And so I want to get into some of these ideas. I'd recommend checking him out. He has some really interesting ideas. He's an interesting thinker. But that I made a recent post here about Elon Musk calling the government a big corporation with a monopoly on violence. This idea too is like a big idea in my moral theory, the whole idea that the state is a monopoly on violence. And I argue that, when the state is actually legitimate and it's tethered to or like founded upon the biological substratum of the nation, then there's no way to describe the state as being a monopoly on violence, because in a genuine living nation that is healthy and thriving, the men of that nation in general are expected to uphold the laws at the individual level. Of course, there's always hierarchy, and there's customs and there's laws that like regulate the use of violence within society, but that in a healthy society, men in general are expected to enforce morality at the individual level and to be like custodians of this responsibility and this power over life and death. And that in the modern world, one of the craziest things about the modern West is that white men in particular have been so demoralized. And literally speaking, they have had morality taken from them to such an extent that you get this bystander effect in so many white men, where they will see something bad happening before their eyes, and they will not take action. They will not enforce their morality because they've been trained that they need to basically enforce morality Well, there's actually two reasons to that. Either you're so cucked that you can only call the state to enforce morality, or you're so demoralized that you think doing the right thing and enforcing morality at the individual level will result in you being punished. So that's one major aspect of the moral theory. So there's a lot of different interesting topics to get into involving morality, and so that's going to be my next stream. Just to give you an idea of what to expect. Anyway, I think I'm going to call it a night. And thank you all for coming. Always good to see you guys in the chat. It's always good to talk with you guys. And I had a good time. I hope that you've gained some perspective here on Christopher Columbus. And I know it's got, I missed the holiday, but if you have any friends that were interested in this question, send them this link, and hopefully they'll have their minds expanded a little bit on that question. So anyway, thank you all for coming, and have a good night.